Hi, everyone. Bear with me just a moment here while I pull up the presentation. So thanks, Tim. Thanks for giving me some time and some airspace today to talk to all of you about housing people experiencing homelessness during COVID-19. Before I jump in, I just want to take a quick moment to let you know that we're listening to you. We're here to problem solve alongside you and support you in whatever way we can. So the purpose of sharing information today isn't meant to overwhelm you or presume that you're not already doing an incredible job. Rather, my intention is to help you explore housing as a response and opportunity amidst your COVID emergency planning. As Tim mentioned, my name is Amanda, and I'm an improvement advisor with the Built for Zero campaign, and I hail out of Hamilton, Ontario. I think it's safe to say that we've all been through a range of emotions over the last few weeks, and I can't help but reflect on how this would be impacting me at different points in my life. I don't know if any of you are going through the same thing, but if this was me 20 years ago, I would have been in a woman's shelter with my 6-month-old daughter, and I would have been really scared. If this was 10 years ago, I would have been on the front lines feeling super overwhelmed. And if it was only 3 months ago, as Tim mentioned, I would have been responsible for the frontline arrangements and setup of temporary sheltering spaces within Hamilton's Emergency Command Center, and while at the same time leading the homelessness serving system and feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. And so I'm sure many of you on the call are in one of those moments in your life right now too. And so through that and thinking through that, I've struggled a lot with how we can house people experiencing homelessness during the pandemic. And I've arrived to this conclusion. I wholeheartedly believe that housing is a right. I believe that housing is medicine. And I believe that housing is the solution to homelessness and the answer to keeping people well and safe. So for me, the question hasn't become, can we house people experiencing homelessness during COVID, but rather, how can we house people experiencing homelessness during COVID? And here's why. If people experiencing homelessness are at the greatest risk of contracting COVID and housing is the solution to homelessness, then the solution to COVID for people experiencing homelessness is still housing. When housing for people experiencing homelessness is not part of the solution to managing this pandemic, my concern is that everything in healthcare will become more of an uphill battle. I believe that this is our opportunity to advance housing as a public health emergency and a fundamental human right. This will preserve life by keeping people isolated while also minimizing the impact on any temporary resources that we have in the system right now, potentially staffing constraints, and also a limited infrastructure for temporary sheltering and isolation. Housing people experiencing homelessness amidst COVID-19 is not a matter of if, but a matter of when. At some point, housing will become an important part of the emergency response, either because people experiencing homelessness will need to vacate temporary sheltering once this issue has resolved, so during the recovery phase, or housing could also become part of the response phase if we reach a point where communities have exhausted their sheltering capacity or some of the workforce becomes ill and off work. Housing is considered an essential service in most communities across the country, and there is a reason for that. Emergency responses and housing responses are in fact not mutually exclusive things. Unlike natural disasters where housing is completely decimated, the housing stock that we're working with has and still exists. How you access it and use it may look different though during the pandemic. I was reflecting on the fact, and it's sort of ironic, that there's never actually been a better time to talk about housing. During the pandemic, housing ultimately benefits the person experiencing homelessness, but it also helps to alleviate the pressures on the emergency response systems and our healthcare systems. And it could also potentially benefit what I presume to be a potentially fragile economy in the weeks to come. I'm almost certain, in fact, that Tim has had this magic ball somewhere and has strategically designed CH supports to prepare you for this very moment. Housing people against all odds is what you do. I've seen us house people when others said it couldn't be done. I've seen you house people with unremarkable constraints, and I've seen this country house people because it's the right thing to do. But this is not business as usual. This is a time to use our human energy in the most effective ways possible. Our efforts to end homelessness have helped us to become complexity busters, innovators, and exceptional problem solvers. How we harness those skills to respond to the public health crisis we're facing right now with housing is what I'd like to focus on next. So people who lead and work exceptionally well through natural disasters, large outbreaks, or mass displacement all have this one thing in common. They're resilient and optimistic about the future and their role in changing the world. And I can appreciate right now how hard that must be to do. But there are some common themes and valuable insights that have been gained from past experiences of people responding to homelessness and housing during natural disasters. I think one of the best examples is Hurricane Katrina. And so here are the top 3 tips or tricks that are pretty common across the board. The first is around creating a culture of problem solving. So complex problems are hard, but not impossible. For those of you who are in the Built for Zero campaign, you know this is one of the themes that we coach on quite a bit. Focus on what's within your control and define the problem you're trying to solve clearly, and I'll suggest as clearly as possible in moments of uncertainty or crisis. So rather than saying, for example, that there's just not enough affordable housing, you might want to reframe the problem to consider that you need X number of 1-bedroom units that are no more than X number of dollars per month. You can think about how you might attain these. Can we try to secure more units, or if units aren't meeting the affordability range, looking at ways to make it more affordable, exploring some options, and remembering that CAH coaches and trainers are here to help work through some of that problem solving with you. Don't be afraid to ask for what you need. And I'll say the magic word in this case is not please, it's need. A fun tidbit is that we're actually socialized to comply with the request when we hear the word need. So use that to your advantage. Take inventory of what you have and be open to new options and possibilities. You could consider, for example, repurposing some of your existing resources and call on other credible sources for assistance. So for example, your mayor might put a call out to the public, to faith-based groups, to developers or apartment associations with a specific housing request. Never has there been a better time to reach outside of the bounds of what you need now, and previous no's might in fact be yeses today. And people do want to help. If you want to make an ask, they'll come up with one for you if you're not specific enough. So people have a tendency to want to do very tangible things like handing out sandwiches or blankets. That may be what you need, but it might not. So asking for specifics will ensure that you can get the resources in hand that would be ultimately most helpful for you during your response. Having been a former bureaucrat, this one's my favorite. So cutting through the red tape. What parts of the housing process could you eliminate, bypass, or deal with later? So you might want to consider streamlining eligibility processes and removing or eliminating whatever steps could be done at a later point in time, such as verification. Planning, doing, and learning during this time may not occur in the order that you're used to. You might need to do the doing part first. But I think there's value in also learning along the way and pivoting when needed. Starting small is better than not starting at all. Ask whether you can house just one person if it feels impossible for you at this moment, and then you can build your response from there. Each community response can be tailored and will have to be tailored based on your own strengths and opportunities within your system. And I always like this saying when we hear that best thinking can come during the most challenging times. I believe that to be true. So communities may in fact learn faster, more efficient, and more effective ways of ending homelessness on the other side of this. So silver lining for us all in this moment. To house people experiencing homelessness during COVID, I just want to share some 3 high-level process steps for you to consider. I'll provide some considerations and examples for you, but this certainly isn't an exhaustive list, and each community will need to tailor their responses according to their own local context. What I will say is you might want to consider designating a housing lead, a main coordinator, or having a housing command center depending on your resources available. The first phase in the process is to identify, locate, and match people experiencing homelessness. So this isn't any different than what we usually do when we're working through ending homelessness. What I will say is different though is how you decide to prioritize and locate and match. For example, you might, instead of working through your prioritization framework, decide that you want to house those that are can be housed most quickly. For example, you might say that people over 60 who are prioritized in your system, look at who can be housed most quickly by being most available, accessible, most engaged, have their paperwork ready, and would be the fastest to house. Or you might say that there is no priority and simply look at who you can match with an available subsidy or unit the quickest. Using your by name list and or repurposing your coordinated access meetings to help match people during the pandemic could become part of your COVID response. You might also want to look at what resources you have and how you use them most effectively. So for example, you might have housing subsidies that you could repurpose towards alleviating shelter pressures during COVID. You might have a local housing benefit that you could repurpose for helping people to get housed during COVID. And you also might have case managers in the social service sector who might not be working right now that you could look at redeploying or temporarily hiring to become part of the COVID response as well. How you might deploy staff could be looked at based on skill rather than job or role. So for example, you might be able to recruit staff from any closed programs to cover the temporary shelter spaces, and or you could redeploy shelter staff to focus on rapid rehousing. The next phase is housing search and lease up. So looking at ways to physically distance obviously is a primary concern. But staff are working from home. There are some staff working from home, I know, in the communities, and this is a great resource for housing search, landlord communication, and paperwork. There are ways to also do viewings right now. So for example, the landlord could drop off the key and you could pick it up without having to see the landlord and then drop it off in the same way. Leases could be done through electronic signature right now. And so it's about just thinking outside of our normal realms of practice and coming up with creative solutions. And finally, the last phase I just wanted to share with you today was thinking about how services and supports are provided and how they could look different. So for example, case management could be done through phone calls or using technology as much as possible. You might also be able to rethink about how social assistance and healthcare programs can assist. So could social assistance issue emergency checks to get people into housing faster? Could typical or usual place-based healthcare services become more mobile or even virtual? Cleaning companies who are accustomed to working in industrial hazardous materials could actually help to prepare the units even during a COVID response. And there are volunteers who are now at home and not working at their volunteer locations that you could leverage to help rally their faith groups or family or friends to develop or create whatever donations you might need. When people are at home, they like to purge and organize, so this is definitely something to capitalize on if you can. And then thinking about what other interventions could be introduced to help minimize the need for temporary sheltering. So thinking about potentially having an emergency assistance fund to help with diversion and rapid exiting whenever possible. I'll say the best examples that I've seen, the most pragmatic I've seen to date, have come out of Connecticut, and those resources will be made available on the CNH3 website. This slide deck will also be made available after the call, so I've included a more detailed slide here on those housing steps, considerations, and examples so that you don't have to jot them down or try to remember them after the call. So I just want to remind you that opportunities still exist despite these difficult times. There is an increased public awareness about the vulnerability of people experiencing homelessness during COVID. People do in fact want to help, and there's lots that we can all now do from home, having technology and other resources. Most of you have increases in federal and provincial funding, so thinking about on the other side of setting up emergency sheltering space, thinking through the longer term solutions like housing. Economic hardship for some can actually create affordable housing opportunities for others. So landlords may be looking for people to put into their units. And lastly, don't lose sight of your own wisdom, experience, and creativity. So Tim reminded me yesterday of this Scottsdale paradox, which was shared in a Jim Collins book called Good to Great, and some of you may have heard of it or even read it. It's about this guy named James Scottsdale who was in the US Navy and became a prisoner of war, and he was actually tortured for over 7 years. Despite having endured unspeakable pain, he never doubted that he would survive. So the story really is a philosophy of duality, and it involves having the discipline to confront the brutal facts about your existing or current situation, while at the same time never losing faith that you'll prevail in the end. So the point here is that in our work, lots of difficulties will be thrown our way, but it's now how we handle these difficulties in the pursuit of ending homelessness that will have the greatest impact on the future of our work. Don't forget that the Built for Zero coaches and TTA trainers are here to support you. My sincerest thanks to all of you who are doing the heavy lifting and perhaps the most important work in the effort to end homelessness in our lifetimes. Please take care of yourselves and each other. Thanks.